Great.
Hi, everybody. This is Rob Bennett with EcoDistricts. Welcome to our first webinar of the year, our Webinar Wednesday series. I'm pleased to have you all with us. We're going to wait just 30 seconds as our attendees settle in. As a reminder, you're in a listen-only mode webinar. Any questions you have for Don and Donzell today can be handled by asking questions on your GoToWebinar question area. So feel free as the webinar is proceeding to type your questions. Teb and I will do our best to curate as many questions as we can. I'll do the asking of those questions for Don and Donzell to answer. So we should have about 15 minutes at the end of the day for questions. We're not going to get to everybody's questions, but of course, for follow-up, you're welcome to contact us or contact Don and Donzell directly to do some follow-along. So we'll wait just a few more seconds and then we'll get going. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Rob Bennett, the CEO, founder of EcoDistricts, and I'm really pleased to have you all with us today for our first Webinar Wednesday series, a series of webinars that we're going to be presenting throughout the year to introduce you all to leading experts in the fields of equitable and sustainable development. Today, I'm really pleased to be joined by a couple old friends and advisors to EcoDistricts, Don Edwards and Donzell Robinson of Justice and Sustainability Associates, to talk about what they call an equitable approach to governance and consensus building. I'd like to start by thanking our sponsors, which includes JSA and generous funding from the Kresge Foundation and the JPB Foundation. Some of you have heard from us over the last couple months that our accredited professional program is now currently free, and that's due to some additional funding from the Kresge Foundation. So we encourage you to look into the AP program and take advantage of the support that Kresge is providing to introduce you to the protocol and ultimately become an EcoDistricts accredited professional. I'll provide some more details at the end of the webinar on that. For those of you who don't know much about EcoDistricts, we're a 6-year-old organization. Our focus and our mission is focused exclusively at the neighborhood level to help move a more robust agenda around equitable and sustainable development in our urban redevelopment projects and our community development projects. We do this primarily through a framework that we created over many years called the EcoDistricts Protocol. And this protocol introduces a series of issues which Don and Donzell are going to cover off in great detail around collaborative and collective impact governance projects, and also the key issues that we think are critical to advancing projects at the neighborhoods and district scale that address the issues of equity, resilience, and climate protection. We designed this protocol to help inspire and help support those who are in the field working on very complicated long-term projects of advancing neighborhood and community development. We are really interested in focusing on locally driven neighborhood and district scale equitable and sustainable development, and Don and Donzell are two leading experts nationally and internationally to help their clients work through the details of strong governance and strong engagement and conflict resolution. This work obviously entails the intersection of investments, trust building, collaboration in order to maximize the kind of benefits that we need to see in our neighborhoods. And it requires projects to take a comprehensive view around sustainability. Two of our key principles that really drive the Ecodistricts protocol and our certification work revolve around this notion of making collaboration inescapable and strong, and to build equity into every decision, and so that we understand what our projects are trying to accomplish and what the benefits and burdens of those project investments will materialize. And that is why we chose to start our webinar series this year with both Don and Donzell. They've helped advise us and some of the projects in our portfolio of Ecodistrict certified projects to help think through their governance work and their engagement work to build trust, to build better outcomes, and really advance the ideas around collaborative governance and equitable development. Don is the founder and CEO and principal of Justice and Sustainability Associates, a DC-based for-profit management consulting firm. He and Donzell are both leading facilitator, mediator, negotiators, nationally recognized in the civic engagement space, and particularly in the fields of land use and development. Don was an early leader in the sustainability movement, participating in both the Earth Summits in 1992 and the second UN Conference for Human Settlements in Istanbul, and served on President Clinton's inaugural Council for Sustainable Development. He's a long-term resident in the District of Columbia and has facilitated dozens of very complicated and contentious land use projects, including the district's Anacostia Waterfront Initiative, the African Burial Ground National Monument in Lower Manhattan, the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall, and DC's 11th Street Bridge project, which I believe they will talk about today. Donzell, who's joined with today, who's the COO and a principal of JSA as well, has had a long and distinguished career as a nationally recognized alternative dispute resolution professional. He leads and facilitates many of JSA's most complex projects, including engagement and governance, sustainable development, and transportation infrastructure projects. Both of them are currently helping us to expand our capacity, building programs at Ecodistricts in the areas of project and governance and engagement. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Don and Donzell. Don will go first. And we look forward to the conversation that follows.
All right, Rob, thank you so much. And let me start by giving a shout out to everyone who has joined this webinar. It's a pleasure to be inaugurating this activity, and I hope that you will make it part of your schedule to participate in them as this webinar series unfolds. I also want to thank my colleagues at Ecodistricts, the board members, staff, and folks who have been part of helping to build this urban-focused movement, as Rob likes to describe it, to help make our urban areas, our cities, places that work for all. And so today, Donzell and I are going to walk you through about 12 slides, and the purpose of them is to give you some sense of, over the last 20 years, how we have shaped an approach, a methodology, if you will, that we think has some applicability across many different kinds of communities and many different kinds of development projects. So just a little bit more about the work we do. It would be fair to say that in order to really understand how we approach and what we'll be talking about in terms of our methods, it really is the result of the lives that we've lived. And the staff at JSA is made up of people who are committed working in urban areas where I don't think it will be a surprise to anyone to hear that oftentimes conflicts arise because it's in cities where the opportunity to live, work, and play with someone that is not like you, does not look like you, is not from where you're from, doesn't sound like you, all of those differences are present. And the challenge is making sure that everyone can be successful, and that success can be defined in ways that reflect a commitment to outcomes, again, that are just and sustainable. So we really don't have a magic wand. What we have is an experience of a highly diverse staff who I thank God for every day, because they bring their lived experience for good and bad to the work we do. And I think that is what has helped us to keep humble, as Donzell likes to say, keep us grounded, and also keep us focused on the work of making cities be places where, when people and place interact, we can in fact develop commitments to each other. We can build a social contract that helps to lift everyone to a higher level. So I would say that what you're going to get today, I'm going to talk about the first 7 or so slides to establish the kind of values-based or principle-based approach that we have. And Donzell is then going to translate that into some of the ways in which we develop process. We are process designers, process managers. We have a specific kind of methodology that we think is proving to help strengthen the capacity and grow the capacity of regular people, people who live in community, people who live in neighborhoods, especially those communities and neighborhoods where there are, as I suspect many of us on this call recognize, people who are the usual suspects, and then there's a category of folks whose voices have not been heard historically and aren't even heard today due to the approach. Let me say a word about that approach, because we talk about building consensus and we talk about engagement, but we almost never talk about outreach. And we approach it from the standpoint of building a constituency for change, that people who start as an audience are transformed into folks who own not only the process and can help inform and guide it, but also people who then have their own idea and can define their own set of benefits that they want a project to deliver. And we look at this from the standpoint of the side of justice that is about distribution of benefits. There are many kinds of justice, and the justice we're interested in is making sure that public dollars and private dollars that are leveraged by public dollars often are put to use to return benefits to the people who produce them in the first place. So that kind of frames our historical and current approach. And we are looking at this as something that, as we share it with you, you will imagine how it can be applied, if not in whole part, in some part, to the work that you're doing wherever you are, in whatever city you are in. So I want to next go to the next slide, if that's okay. We have, next slide, we have talked about it from the very beginning as being a principles-based methodology. And I'll let you look at this slide for just a little while. Not saying that you have to adopt these principles, but we have discovered that principles are something that people can find expression of their interests if you put them in front of them, and folks will allow you then to guide them because they are able to evaluate your performance, our performance, against the principles we espouse. And so we try to make sure that we state our assumptions up front, and we approach the work that we do in every project and with every group of residents and stakeholders with the sense of being able, as we say in the 10th principle, that we'll state our objectives up front and evaluate whether we can be evaluated on whether we have achieved them. This is very important, especially when you're thinking about the population of folks who oftentimes don't have their interests and benefits top of mind for people who are in charge of actually developing projects. Next slide. So a lot of the work that we do is based on other people's work, work that we think was important to incorporate into the work we do. This is a set of core values that some of you have hopefully been introduced to. The International Association of Public Participation has been around for a while. It is committed to these kinds of core values. And the idea of having core values is basically for us a way to associate ourselves with a larger body of practitioners, and recognizing that being associated with that larger body of practitioners is part of the accountability and also part of the credibility that we want people to recognize in how we work and how we hold ourselves accountable for certain kinds of products and certain kinds of outcomes. Next slide. The work that we do, Donzell, myself, many of our colleagues are framed also by these standards of conduct. The Association for Conflict Resolution has developed these standards of conduct because basically we want to approach every project like professionals. And of course, one of the things that determines or defines a profession and defines professionals and professionalism is a standard, is a code, is a set of values or principles that guide behavior and define accountability. And so one of the things that has been important to JSA is introducing these kinds of standards into communities, into neighborhoods, into audiences where this kind of accountability has not typically or historically been present. The importance of having these slides that I've gone through so far are to establish that there is a trust building component and there is a credibility smell test that we recognize and are committed to passing. The work that we are doing, and I don't want to talk about this theoretically, the work that we're doing across the country and that ourselves are doing has to be based in credibility, trust, and it has to recognize that earning of trust and that communication of credibility is being done in the face of years, decades, in some cases, many decades of distrust, lack of accountability, all of the kinds of historic injustices and unequitable approaches and outcomes that we find in our cities, not just across the United States, but across the world. So this is where it becomes a part of our commitment to establish a new way of being held accountable and a new approach, because we recognize this history and we are committed to creating a different future and making it possible for people to believe that creating a new future is possible. So that becomes part of that social contract I mentioned. If we're going to engage people in giving us their trust, we should understand that what has to be overcome for that trust to be shared. Next slide. So I'm going to just briefly talk about one of the critical components of doing the work. And I want to just focus on these people. These are real people, residents and stakeholders of the District of Columbia. These photographs are taken from work that we've been doing here. And we've been fortunate, as Rob said, to be part of a process, a civic process that started in 1999 when we founded the firm, of recreating the civic in the District of Columbia. And that is, in fact, one of the things that is innovating the work that we do wherever we go. The idea of civic culture, civic infrastructure, civic engagement, these are all tied to the challenge of overcoming, as I've said, decades of the lack of trust and inability for people to see themselves in the picture, so to speak, as regards creating the neighborhoods and the communities that they want, that work for them. One of the biggest parts of what we therefore focus on is helping people develop behaviors to speak with each other in a sense of safety and sanctuary, with honesty and a recognition that differences can be resolved and differences can in fact lead to stronger, better outcomes if we figure out a way and design a way for people to speak to each other and with each other and listen constructively. So this talks about polarized debates, which frankly, all of us on this webinar have probably participated in more than we'd like, where you just can't wait until it gets over. It's like some of the time that you'll never get back in your life, and it's like, wow, how many more of these do I have to go through? In the public realm, one of the ways in which our work has proved to be useful is this idea of designing and creating a process for people to know what they're needing to talk about, to be informed and educated, but then also to trust and have confidence that someone like me or Donzell or some of our colleagues will help to manage the conversation so that progress is constructed, so that benefits can be defined and described in a material and concrete way, and that people learn how to interact with each other, which is, believe it or not, I'm sure many of you believe it, is not always how these meetings and engagements occur. So the idea of having constructive dialogue basically is grounded in our commitment to make sure that a different group of people, many differences, can come up with something that works for all of them. Next slide. So this will be my last slide, and then I'm going to kick it over to Donzell, because we actually would love to have enough time. We've kind of designed this so that there are 30 minutes or so for your questions and comments, but maybe a little less. This idea of community development mediation is what I kind of created some years ago, 20 years ago. And it was critical to be able to think of using principles of alternative dispute resolution in a community development or land use context. And so part of how we initially tested our approach and our methodology took place during a 4-year process to revise the District of Columbia's comprehensive plan or master plan. And this is the actual cover of the vision document that was used back in 2002, and we finally were able to develop and get the City Council of the district to adopt a new comprehensive plan unanimously, which had never been done in the history of the city. And it was about growing an inclusive city. And it was intended to make it possible for the district that you have today, for better or worse, to be much more inclusive and equitable, and to be a place that could represent an approach and a way to work in neighborhoods, work for neighborhoods at a level where people would participate, they could expect to benefit, and they would know that there were, in fact, folks in government and other sectors who felt accountable to the agreements that they had reached. So this is something I'm going to now kick over to Donzell, who's going to speak about how we apply it in our work and our methodology. Donzell?
Thanks, Don. And so, really want to kind of quickly dive into this, and because we want to make sure you all have enough time for questions. One of the things I want to just kind of set as a premise and give you the back end going, what we hope you get from this is that when we talk about land use mediation, conflicts around land use and development, it's, most people start with, oh, we need to get everyone on common ground. And what we try to do is say, beyond the common ground, how do we get people to higher ground? Meaning, how do we create subject matter experts around a specific topic to resolve conflicts with regards to land use? So when we think about the conflicts of land use and the lotus of that conflict, there are traditionally 3 types of pull. And that's or tensions, and that's the pull of land use for economic development, land use for environmental sustainability or the sustaining of green spaces, and land use for social justice. Right? How do you ensure that everyone has access to land ownership for the purpose of having equity in life? And so, what JSA has attempted to do is, in its principles, in its practice, is to be the answer of how to effectively engage municipalities, communities, business advocates, opponents, in a deliberative process, which foundationally kind of can improve the potential of the longevity of a project and the success of the project for all of those who are impacted by it. So we created what we call some best practices. And part of that best practice is the equitable design. And so when we think about the equitable design, we think about how do we develop the capacity of stakeholders to understand a project or development, and or create a shared vision around goals and financial and technical feasibility of the solutions that they come up with. So what you find is a lot of times people aren't really thinking about what will this space look like 30 years from now. They're doing a master plan, or what will this space look like 20 years from now? What type of stores? What is the walkability? What type of transportation will, if not me, my children or future residents have who are in this space? And so we have to give them the opportunity to begin to think about that, right? And be able to build their capacity to think in that way. And as they think about that, also think about it in the framework or in the parameters of what's financially feasible and what's technically feasible, what actually can be done. And then we also look at how do we gain support and guidance from our stakeholders? How do we begin to transition them from being participants? And Don talked about it, and that'll be a whole nother workshop going from, public and, informing or outreach to public engagement. But how do we get them to see themselves as owners of the process, to be and regardless of, their social or economic status, to truly believe that their input and their desires are equal and equitable to the input and desires of others. And then we also look at how do we develop the capacity of stakeholders to understand a project or development, right? And and what is needed for them to be able to come up with solutions that they believe will support, their aspirations, and not only their aspirations, but like we said before, the aspirations of future generations. Once we kind of do all of that, then we kind of, make sure, that people are, when they're fully invested in the process, the way we make sure that they stay invested in that process is to create alignment around issues and information, right? And Don talked a little bit about how do we build that trust. And trust comes from transparency and predictability. People need to know what information they're going to get, how they're going to get that information, what step in the process they're in, what's the next step in the process, and if a specific issue that they want to address isn't being addressed now, when will that be addressed, and how can they monitor if that issue has been forgotten, right? And so we begin to look at, building that trust, having that connectivity, resolving and managing conflicts that traditionally damage communities. And so, one of the first things we do is, we create a process for engaging communities that has, which consists of, a planned routine steps. And we believe these steps are both strategic and tactical. And these actions are necessary in order to meet the project's desires. So the first thing we do is, we don't make assumptions. So we begin to map the stakeholders, right? We do a conflict assessment. And one of the things that Don talked about is that what's really unique about JSA, when you consider other organizations or firms that, are in this area, is that we are conflict resolvers. And I'll touch base on that a little bit. And what that really means is that we don't kind of plan, create processes that mute conflict. We don't try to spin conflict. We don't try to gloss over them or, paint a rosy picture of how well people are getting along if they're not. We don't look at conflict as things that we can't control or that just have to be there. We address them. We try to at least manage them because not all conflict can be resolved. And we start that process by, really beginning to understanding who is and should be at the table. And when we think about the eco district's imperatives around equity, that is step one. And that step happens immediately. The second that you begin to say, hey, we have an idea around an action for a district that we want to act on, the next thing you should say is, and we want to make sure that everyone who should be a part of the conversation is part of that conversation, and they are a part of that conversation at the right time. So often we, make decisions, we create processes, we develop a structure, and then we say, now let's invite others into our house. Instead of saying, we want to build a home, everyone who's going to live here should be a part of that conversation. So our initial assessment involves a broad range of community-based, or depending on the space or the design of the project, whether it's regional or national, or even international, we begin to look at who are the stakeholders. And once those stakeholders are identified, we begin to map them through our matrix. I mean, we begin to assess, are they informed or are they involved? And so we kind of create this, kind of multi-approach around those who are involved and informed. And the continuum goes all the way to those who are both uninformed and uninvolved. And so once we kind of begin to kind of create this roadmap, and we've met with, the parties who engaged us in, creating this process, we then begin to say, okay, now that we know who should be here, and we've worked on making sure everyone is at the table, we begin to, create the structure for communication to happen, for engagement to happen, and for consensus to happen. And that framework is produced through, and I'm going to keep repeating these words, an inclusive, transparent, and participatory process. And that includes us, again, articulating our engagement goals. What are we trying to accomplish? Most times, if nothing else, it is so that everyone who believes they are affected or impacted by a project has the ability to speak to the project. It also says that those who have entered into this engagement process will be educated or at least informed about all the things that should be considered as they make decisions. We're going to set up structures to be able to objectively measure outcomes. We're going to be able to articulate our strategies. We're going to create a schedule for things to happen. And we're also going to make sure that we present evaluation tools for stakeholders to be able to evaluate the engagement process in its entirety. Then we also want to make sure that, as we look at the creation of, the community partnership, we begin with the end in mind. And what we mean by that is we're going to build capacity. We're going to make sure that we're depositing skills and tools within the community members where they can maintain and really adapt the process that we've created to ensure that the community approach to resolving problems can continue even after JSA is no longer a part of the process. So what I want to do now is, kind of use two of projects that we're currently working on of the many to kind of hopefully highlight how we do this. And if I'm able to pull this off and leave time for questions, what I hope you'll be able to get out of this is, one, that how we make sure we don't make assumptions. Two, how we begin to look at communities. And three, most important, that it is doable. I mean, I can imagine that if any of you all have done work where you've tried to bring, different and divergent opinions and thoughts and interests together to, achieve something that is over a long period of time, sometimes 10, 20, 30 years, depending on the type of plan, it can feel undaunting, right? And oftentimes we get to a point where we just kind of say, you know what, let's get a small group of people in the room, and then let's go out and explain to people why we've had their best interest at heart. And and we can talk about the kind of approaches to conflict, but what we recommend and champion is a collaborative approach, meaning bring everyone in early, educate them, do it often. And when you do that, even though that process may seem slow and arduous up front, when you look at the overall effort required to come to agreement, it is far easier to get people on board early on than it is to have to change your structure because people are in conflict later. And so, that again, maybe we can line up some other seminars to talk about, conflict styles and competing versus collaboration or avoidance. But for right now, what I want to do is just kind of look at the first project, which is Lord George Avenue, which is here in Washington, D.C. So, for those who aren't familiar with D.C., Lord George Avenue, George Avenue itself is one of the thoroughfares that goes from downtown D.C. all the way out to Maryland. It's divided into two parts. The more denser part, which has businesses and street fronts, main, kind of stores, bars, restaurants, is Lower Georgia Avenue. Upper Georgia Avenue becomes more residential as it heads into Maryland. Lower Georgia Avenue also is where Howard University is. And so, throughout time, Georgia Avenue was experienced where it was predominantly white. Desegregation happened, white flight happened, it became predominantly African American. And now, with gentrification, it is becoming, predominantly white again. And so right now, what you have are, different stakeholders, and you have, and we actually started this project because the council member, Caucasian, a white female, I said, hey, I want to make sure that, Lower Georgia Avenue maintains the culture and the vibrancy that it has as being a diverse neighborhood, that is with a middle class African-American community, even as, property prices rise, businesses change, how can we create a development project or a development plan that ensures that all of that is sustained? And so, like I said, the first thing we did was our stakeholder analysis, which we conducted in the various interviews. And so really our mapping of that was created where we had, big realtors, you would think, who are land banking, but we also had realtors who had been a part of the community for years and really were disheartened by the change of the community and really were interested in trying to figure out how can they stay competitive, make a profit, but also support, the businesses that they've had long-term leases with. And as properties were transitioning or moving from one type of property or storefront or being remodeled, how can they ensure, or even on the short term, that businesses that were displaced from other places could use, the first level or the street level, even as the secondary levels were changing from, in some cases, non-existent, and they were building apartments on top of them, to, moderate income residences to higher income residents. So we went through and we talked to the entire community. And one of the things, some of the assumptions that people may make, but what we found, as we did our analysis, is that you would think that, community advocates, were unified in it, their desired outcome, but they weren't, because when you kind of did a dive into what was happening there, you saw that community representatives, there was actually some factions or regions between the two of them. And what you kind of saw was, and I'm going to, I know we have 20 minutes right now for questions, so I'm going to kind of bump through this real quick. So what we, just to kind of get to the end of it, is what we ended up doing was we realized that, hey, we need to create in our design an inclusive, equitable process that had an advisory participation of key residents, but also gave space for community members who had unique concerns about specific issues, the space to talk about those. And so we created a steering committee where, the overarching decision-making group that consisted of all of the different representatives of stakeholders, from retail owners, businesses, advocates for housing, workforce development, and they became the governing body. Then we also created working groups so that people could have, deep, nuanced conversations about specific things. And those working groups became communication and engagement, local business and corridor planning, workforce development. And just, real quick, because one of the things people brought out was, hey, we love the fact that we have amenities and businesses, but right now what's happening is there's an influx of nightlife, restaurants, clubs, bars. And we would love a variety of businesses that allow for people who want to work, from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. and not just people who want to work from 3 p.m. to 2 a.m. And so, they created the local businesses, addressed that, workforce development addressed that, housing. This area had both public housing and, like I said, high income housing as well. So we looked at housing, and we also looked at how do we trust the information that we have. And so another working group was data and metrics, because one of the things when we talk about transparency, people have to believe the information that is there. The other project is in the north side of Pittsburgh, and this is the Light of Life Rescue Mission. So this is where a shelter was being built in a mixed-use factory/residential area on the north side. In this instance, stakeholders felt that the location of the shelter was the result of an agreement between politicians and local decision makers that perhaps wasn't done with any input or full input from other members of the community. And specifically that the community influencers who were part of the conversation didn't want the facility in their part of the north side. And so when we were brought on board, clearing and grubbing had already begun. The foundation was about to be poured. And so even though we had people who were actively, campaigning to stop the project in its entirety, we realized that a win-win would be, how do we, one, get people to, see that this project was moving forward, period. There was no way to stop it. But be engaged enough to be able to figure out, how to mitigate their concerns to the level where they felt comfortable. And so again, we started our process with interview and feedback, and really to drill down a little bit, we only asked 3 questions for this one. Do you have a history of interaction with the organization? What are your concerns regarding the new facility? And what are 1 or 2 things that the organization could do to build your confidence moving forward? And we asked those questions because, through our interview, we heard that people just felt like the organization who was building the mission, the homeless shelter in this area, did not engage with integrity with the community early on. So one of the things we wanted to do was build integrity. So through our assessment, again, creating that multi-stakeholder forum intended to guide development implementation in an equitable way around development, we realized we had to create working groups around public safety and security. And the reason we did that because through our responses, people cited discomfort with loitering and encampment of the homeless population. We created a working group around program and practices because, ironically, there were also other businesses who saw this as an opportunity to be able to create a workforce that they could, train and give back to their community. So they really wanted to be interested in what types of programs were there and how they could contribute. And also other people were were worried about the extensive mental health needs of the clientele. And then of course there was the sustained community engagement, where nearly all of the stakeholders emphasized the importance of accountability, transparency, and continued conversation, even when the building is complete. And so, what's really important about this project is it really shows where our conflict resolution is important, because one of the things that, even just last night we had this program, and then I'll kind of pause and we can go to questions, was because, we had one participant who, no matter what we did, they were never satisfied. They never gave ground. They never said, anything was even a possibility, let alone a good idea. And we just finally had to, really use those mediation skills to get to the point where this person felt safe enough and in a safe space to be able to say, look, I've already lost what she projected as $1 million worth of contracts just at the conversation of homeless people being in this area. And, one of the things that we were able to do is give her space, because even though most of the stakeholders were ready to move forward, we were able to give her space to articulate her issues that were not on the table. And that was the financial loss that she was already facing. And out of that conversation began what would probably be another working group, is how do we support businesses who may impact loss? And the group who was running this shelter was very interested in being able to engage in that conversation. So, like I said, the highlight is, we never make assumptions. We want to make sure we are able to drill down in the conflict, because most times when stakeholders won't engage, they don't feel heard or a part of the conversation, or they don't see themselves in the solution. And so, I hope that kind of gives you all kind of insight around what we believe is equitable engagement when we talk about, land use conflict resolution. And with that, I'll turn it over for questions.
Great, thank you, Donzell. Thank you, Don, for that presentation. It's always difficult to condense very complex and nuanced work into 45 minutes, but you did a very nice job. Lots of great questions coming across the transom here, and they range from broad questions to sort of more tactical questions. And I'm gonna pick a couple in both camps. I want to start with a couple questions around language and how you work to create a common language with stakeholders in which the range of knowledge and the range of sort of technical issues could be quite broad and quite specific. There's also a lot of new language around equitable development, social equity, collective impact, et cetera, et cetera. Can you guys talk about how you deal with the issue of language in developing processes that range of stakeholders, from the technical sort of urban planners and developers to the community members can participate in?
I'll start, and I'll be very short. We respect the fact that language can clarify or it can obfuscate and confuse. And so for us, we try very much to not speak in coded language. Encoded language is culturally coded, it's literacy level coded, it's coded by technical references, it's coded in many kind of inferences that don't come out and just state the values behind them. So we try to avoid all of that. We're very intentional, and we try to scrub the way we interact and what we write in the development of our collaterals, so that we are not speaking to a minority, but we're speaking to a majority of people who we want to stay involved. The last thing I'll say about that, Rob, is that from the standpoint of code, we have to respect the fact that if you ask someone what you think about something, that already implies that they've been thinking about it. So we think that the most important step is this information and education component, which makes it possible for people to see that at some subsequent point, having been fed some information and education, they can now legitimately be asked to give comment and to express an opinion. So that's some of what we try to pay particular attention to as we interact in these places where there are diverse audiences that we have invited and hopefully gotten to come into the room.
Great, thank you for that. And I know there's a lot of detail in sort of decoding and creating a common language that I'm sure you could spend a lot of time talking through. A couple questions I'm going to put together around sort of program design, for lack of a better term. Questions around how do you incent developers to engage in meaningful and productive conversations with community? So I think this is a question around, certain interest groups like developers who have projects they're wanting to move quickly. They traditionally don't engage with community members except for very specific things like entitlements or building permits, et cetera. How do you incent them to engage in a meaningful process? And then a second piece of that is a question around, are these committees that you mentioned in the Georgia Avenue, are they volunteer? How do you design the working groups? So a question of sort of incentives and design.
Well, I'll just type the incentive. Maybe Donzell can deal with the design. Developers, even though there are many different kinds of developers and they are across a spectrum of development and in types of development projects, all are, I think, at least in my experience, the majority of them are motivated not by just making profits, but by actually doing something that is good for the people that they are trying to serve. I mean, most of their reputations, at least in the communities where we work, is about how will they be perceived? Have they added to the burden of the community, or have they lifted the burden? So our incentive is basically to appeal and help clarify and define what is in their best interest, especially if they want to continue to have opportunity. And so from our standpoint, it starts with what we believe. I don't think the system is set up for developers to approach their projects from a triple bottom line standpoint. And part of our work is to help them define and to illuminate a path that they can develop a triple bottom line approach. This is not to say that every developer is interested in that. We know that that's not so. But I think it starts with a recognition that there are all kinds of developers and they are motivated by many different results. And we have to, inform ourselves about them and their results as we assess any other stakeholder in the process. Donzell, you want to talk about design?
Sure. So design is as much art as it is technical application, right? And so when we think about design of these groups, what we want to make sure of is that we have all of the divergent voices in the conversation, both at the higher level, steering committee, advisory, decision-making body, as well as the nuanced, deep dive, subject matter specific working groups, right? And so if you get those, and the art piece is really being able to hear at a nuanced level where voices may be in the same heading in the same direction or at the same octave, but really are a pitch off, right? And so people may all say, yeah, we want better housing for vulnerable populations, but one may see that vulnerable population as returning citizens, where another may see that vulnerable population as families, or with children with low income. And so, you really want to make sure that you have the divergent voices in the conversation. If that happens organically, you let it happen organically. But if it doesn't happen organically, it is the responsibility of the practitioner and the facilitator to make sure that those voices are there, whether it's through invite or other incentives. And then when we're also doing this, we make sure that the space is there for people to participate. So we're thinking about people who have children. Are we making sure that they have daycare? And are we making sure that the hours of the meetings happen in ways that people can participate? So the design is to consider the voices and make sure that they're all present.
Thank you, Don and Donzell. There's a series of questions on the impact of COVID. And I know, having talked to you, that you have kind of repositioned and invested in virtual meeting design, and it's something you're quite good at. Can you talk about, what this era of, homebound and distance meeting design looks like, and how you overcome some of the issues around digital equity, lack of access for many community members and processes, and what you're doing to overcome some of those barriers?
I'll jump in on that one. First of all, the technology available gives us many different ways to keep in contact and to engage with people. For a lot of our work, that means we're going to use not only computer-based technologies, but largely phone-based technologies. And the phone-based technologies recognize that you can do any number of bells and whistles available, from creating small group breakout rooms on a phone, and even creating polls and other kinds of ways to actually measure support for a particular policy or decision. I think the other thing is, quite frankly, in my view, there's always the upside and the downside. That's the dialectic. And ultimately, what we're looking to do is advance an approach to building community without having to be in physical contact, until that becomes something that we can once again do safely. The fact of the matter is that one of the things that COVID-19 as a pandemic has created is an opportunity to engage people at lower cost, and with more dispersion and more access. So we're trying to be helpful to our clients and to offer our assistance from designing these kind of processes for the entire life of JSA to others, so that they can take advantage. The truth of the matter is that even after COVID-19 has reduced or been resolved to some degree, it's not going to go away. And so what we're also trying to do is advise and help people build their capacity, recognizing that a new normal is probably going to emerge if it hasn't already emerged, and it will be necessary for them to have chops and capacity and skills to utilize the technologies that are going to be available, that are actually going to be used more competitively as we go into the future. Because, my own personal belief is this is just the new normal, and this is how we're going to have to behave. I guess the last thing I'd say is there's also extra work that goes in. So, there's convening a webinar like this, and then there's the personal point of contact and checking in with people. It's the equivalent of the neighbor who drops in to see how you're doing, or the person who watches out for your bike while you're doing an errand. We also believe and we think that it's very important that it not be all technology and no human presence. We actually have to do both. We save on the technology side, but we have to invest on the human contact side. And, that's done from phone calls and video conferences, but you got to have both.
Thank you, Don. We are come to the end of this webinar, and we're just getting going, unfortunately, with the questions. There's a lot of questions about a level of specificity in your project design, questions about what are the 5 capitals, what level of depth do you engage, and a question about cost. And you started to touch on that, Don, around the cost of doing this kind of intentional design work and how you engage communities. There's a lot of movement around paying community members to participate. So there's a lot of questions that we haven't gotten to. I'm going to encourage everyone on this webinar to reach out to Don and Donzell. That's the reason we have these webinars, is to introduce you to some of the leading experts. At EcoDistricts, we're focused on promoting the kind of thoughtful, community-based design that Don and Donzell are so adept and have a long history in providing for projects. And we're really pleased that they both could join us today. We will make this a recording available, and we will make the slides available to you all. We know webinars are difficult. There's been technology questions. Sorry about my blunders at the front end on that front. But again, thanks so much. We'll be in touch with the next set of webinars coming up in July. Julian Nagamon of Tufts University, the sort of father of just sustainability, will be presenting, author of many books. But more webinars to come, and we really look forward to seeing you back for these webinar Wednesdays. Thanks again, Don and Donzell, and we'll see you around.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Rob. Thank everyone for participating.